In World War II, the most dangerous warship was no longer the one with the biggest guns. It was the one that could kill from beyond the horizon. For the first time in history, entire fleets could fight without ever seeing each other. A sailor could die in a battle against a ship he never saw. At Pearl Harbor, 6 Japanese carriers changed the war in a single morning. But the weapon that gave Japan its greatest victory would soon become its greatest weakness. Because a carrier was not just a ship, it was pilots, radar, fuel, mechanics, escorts, and luck. And when those pieces began to break, the largest flight decks in the Pacific became floating traps. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers vanished in a matter of hours. This is the story of how the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship and turned the sea itself into a battlefield. Before the aircraft carrier ruled the ocean, there was another king, the battleship. It was steel, armor, and national pride turned into a machine. Its guns could throw shells farther than any army cannon on land. For decades, admirals believed this was how wars at sea would be decided. 2 battle fleets would find each other, line up, open fire. The winner would be the side with the bigger guns, thicker armor, and better aim. And when World War II began, many still believed that was true. The aircraft carrier existed, but to many, it still looked like support. Useful for scouting and protection, maybe useful for surprise attacks, but not the weapon that would decide the greatest naval war in history. Because the ocean was about to get much bigger and much deadlier. The aircraft carrier looked strange compared to the old giants of the sea. It had no massive guns pointing toward the horizon, no thick wall of firepower visible from miles away. At first glance, it did not look like the future of naval warfare. It looked vulnerable, almost unfinished. But its real weapon was not the ship itself. It was everything the ship carried into battle. The planes gave it reach, the pilots gave it precision, radar and reconnaissance gave it eyes, escorts gave it protection, and logistics gave it staying power. It was powerful because it was a floating airbase, moving across the ocean. And once navies understood that, sea warfare would never be the same again. The warning came before Pearl Harbor, not in the Pacific, but in the Mediterranean, under cover of darkness. On the night of November 11th, 1940, the British sent just 21 aircraft toward the Italian fleet at Taranto. They were not sleek, modern fighters. They were slow biplanes, flying into one of the most dangerous harbors in Europe. Below them were battleships, the old kings of the sea, protected inside their own naval base. But the British aircraft carried a weapon that could change everything. One by one, the planes dropped low over the water. Then the torpedoes went in. By morning, 3 Italian battleships had been hit. The British had lost only 2 aircraft. Taranto did not end the age of the battleship, but it showed something terrifying. A ship did not need to see a battleship to cripple it. And across the world, other navies were paying attention. The warning had been fired. The world just had not fully understood it yet. 1 year after Taranto, the warning became a catastrophe. This time, it was not 21 aircraft, it was 353. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched their planes toward Pearl Harbor. The American battleships were sitting below, packed inside the harbor. They were powerful, armored, and heavily armed. But their enemy was not coming across the water. It was coming out of the sky. In 2 waves, Japanese pilots struck ships, airfields, and aircraft on the ground. By the end of the attack, much of the American battleship force had been damaged or sunk. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, and the world had now seen what carriers could do from hundreds of miles away. But there was one problem. The ships Japan most needed to destroy were not there. The American carriers had escaped, and that single absence would matter more than anyone knew. Pearl Harbor proved the power of the aircraft carrier. At Coral Sea, the old rules of naval war broke apart. For the first time, 2 major fleets fought without ever seeing each other. The real battle happened in the sky. Aircraft searched across miles of open water, trying to find the enemy first. This was the future of naval war: invisible, distant, and deadly. By June 1942, Japan still looked unstoppable. Then came Midway. This was supposed to be another Japanese victory. Instead, it became a trap. 4 of Japan's most dangerous carriers were there: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Together, they carried the striking power that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. But at Midway, timing, confusion, and American air attacks began to close in. Then, the dive bombers came through the clouds. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning. Later, Hiryu struck back, but it too was found and hit. By the end of the battle, all 4 carriers were doomed. In just a few hours, the core of Japan's great carrier force had been shattered. In carrier warfare, a few minutes could decide the fate of an empire. Japan was losing more than ships. It was losing the men who made those ships dangerous. Experienced pilots were hard to replace, and every battle made that problem worse. The real loss was not just steel, it was skill, memory, and experience. By 1943, the balance of the war at sea was beginning to change. Japan could still fight, but America was building something bigger than a fleet. It was building a machine. New Essex-class carriers became the backbone of the American Navy. Smaller, Independence-class carriers added even more striking power. Escorts carriers protected convoys, hunted submarines, and supported landings. And when ships were damaged, America could repair them and send them back. When planes were lost, new ones arrived. When fleets needed fuel, tankers followed them across the ocean. So what happens when one country can replace losses faster than the enemy can sink them? The answer is simple. The war becomes a test of endurance, and America could endure longer. The most famous carriers of the war were huge. But some of the most important were small. These were escort carriers. They were slower, smaller, and far less glamorous than the great fleet carriers of the Pacific. But in the Atlantic, they had a big job. They protected convoys carrying the supplies Britain needed to survive. They sent aircraft out over the ocean, where land-based planes could not always reach. That was important because German U-boats hunted where the sea was wide and cover was thin. Escort carriers helped close that deadly gap. Their planes searched for submarines, attacked them, and forced them to stay hidden. They also became the center of hunter-killer groups that actively searched for U-boats. They were built for endurance, protection, and constant pressure. And in the Battle of the Atlantic, that made them indispensable. By late 1944, Japan still had carriers, but they were no longer the deadly strike force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. Too many ships were gone, too many veteran pilots were gone, and at Leyte Gulf, that collapse became impossible to hide. Japan sent its remaining carriers north under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. But this time, they were not meant to win the battle. They were meant to distract the enemy. The carriers had become bait. It was a desperate gamble. Use the symbol of naval power to lure the Americans away. The plan worked, but only for a moment. American aircraft found the Japanese carriers and attacked. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from Pearl Harbor, was sunk. The proud strike force that had once led Japan's rise was now being sacrificed just to buy time. So how did Japan's proud carriers end up as bait? Because by the end of the war, Japan no longer had the power to use them as carriers, only as decoys. The battleship did not disappear in World War II. It still had armor, firepower, and an important role to play. Battleships could still bombard coastlines, protect fleets, and fight on the surface. But the future of naval war had already moved somewhere else. It had moved above the sea. The most dangerous warship was no longer the one with the biggest guns. It was the one that could launch striking power across hundreds of miles of ocean and land. That was the revolution of the aircraft carrier. It turned the flight deck into the longest reach in naval warfare. And by the end of the war, the center of sea power was no longer inside the gun turret.
With all of the course is clear, the red flag comes down.
It was on the deck, in the air, and far beyond the horizon. The former king of the sea had not vanished, but it had been replaced.